Good morning. Just a couple of points I'd like to make before introducing Mike. It's very clear as you look around the country and look at research and look at states that are being successful, that economic opportunity and the state's economic competitiveness is determined by the productivity of its people. It's not putting a lot of money into bricks and mortar and corporate welfare. It's really investing in people because industry is looking for people and looking for a state that's making productive use of its people, its capital, its natural resources. And there's a very clear link between what I've just said and education, because places that are making productive use and have a productive population invest in schools and have strong public school systems. And there are a couple of things in Rhode Island that I think are important. We did a poll, Hassenfeld Institute did a poll about 2 months ago, and the results were interesting. People have a pretty high impression about public education. 68% of the people that responded to the poll gave our schools passing grades. 90% of parents who had children in schools felt the schools were doing at least an adequate job in providing an education. But at the same time, there were other numbers that raised questions about productivity and raised questions as to whether or not we really have an adequacy crisis in public education. Only 37% felt that our schools were doing a good job in preparing kids for good-paying jobs, and about 50% felt that they were doing a good job in preparing kids for college. So there's an expectation issue because decent grades, but concerns about how productive schools were producing students. And it's obvious when you start to sort through the numbers, and this is why Mike's comments I think are so important this morning, is that we have a performance gap. There's a clear performance gap between white African Americans and Hispanics. If you look at something like English language skills, proficiency of whites is about 45%. It's about half of that for non-whites. Same in math, 40% to 16%. And so we know we have to close that gap because if you look at the demographic patterns in the state, the demography is flat. We are changing population. And the change is moving in the direction of closing some of these performance gaps and investing, and that's the question of how you define adequacy and making that investment. The second issue is about adequately funding. State has made significant progress over the last decade in implementing a school aid formula, and yet there are programs announced almost yearly, but I wonder how many are really funded at scale. It's not a question of demonstration projects or doing something well in one or two districts. It's a question of focusing priorities and doing things well with the 36 or 37 school districts. There's a property tax overload. It became very clear this morning when you heard from the superintendents of Woonsocket and Providence. And until we get serious about addressing those issues on a sustaining basis, there will continue to be economic challenges and challenges of adequacy. And so I don't think we could have had a better champion come and speak to us today than Mike Rebell. He is probably the foremost champion of establishing rights for all kids and rights to have access to equal educational opportunities, and he'll talk about that and adequacy. Mike currently is the executive director of the Center for Education Equity, and he's professor of practice law and education policy at the Columbia Teachers College. Mike?
Okay, good morning, everyone. So I think my job today, if I can get this microphone to stand firm for a minute, is to give you a national overview of what's been happening in the area of educational equity, funding for educational equity in particular. I think you all know the bottom line as far as the fiscal equity suits that have been attempted in Rhode Island, and I'm glad my good friend Steve Robinson, who has been battling on that cause for almost as long as I have, unfortunately has not been able to prevail with the Rhode Island Supreme Court. Similar cases have been brought in 46 out of the 50 states, and you're in the minority. Plaintiffs have won 60% of these cases nationwide. We won a big victory in New York a number of years ago that I had a hand in. So I want to talk to you about some possibilities also, even though there has been this frustration in dealing with the Rhode Island Supreme Court, and that is looking at things from a federal perspective. But let me first put the matter in context and give you a little background on this phenomenon of fiscal equity suits, education adequacy suits. We use different labels on them, and there actually are differences in the legal strategies that stand behind those two things. All of this stems from a major decision of the United States Supreme Court known as Rodriguez versus San Antonio Independent School District, that was decided by the Supreme Court 45 years ago this week, actually. It was March 21st, 1973. That was a major case that focused on the issue of inequity in educational financing. And it had an interesting background, actually. This was 1973. Actually, the case was filed in 1968 in Texas. It really was a follow-up to Brown versus Board of Education. You're all aware of the fact that it was 1954 when the U.S. Supreme Court handed down its landmark decision outlawing racial segregation in the schools and announcing, repeating it 5 times in that decision, that all children in the United States had a constitutional right to equal educational opportunity. Well, it took a while for the court to fully enforce that edict. I guess some people would say it still hasn't been fully enforced, but for the first 10 years after Brown, there was real resistance in the Deep South. The court really hung back and was not proactive in really pushing desegregation. But by the mid to late 60s, the Supreme Court had gotten much more proactive. The Kennedy and Johnson administration had taken it seriously. Things were coming together. So by the late 60s, you did have substantial desegregation of most public schools throughout the South. It was very dramatic. In the early 60s, about 1 or 2% of Southern schools were desegregated. By the late 60s, it was over 65%. But an interesting thing happened once they had achieved desegregation, and that is many people realized that in a good number of the school districts throughout the South, what was happening is you had poor white children attending school with poor black children, and none of them were getting a real educational opportunity. And the real stumbling block at that point, people realized, was this question of resources. To have effective desegregation, to have effective education, you need adequate resources. I think we heard a substantiation of that in depth with the first part of the program this morning. So a test case was brought to the U.S. Supreme Court from San Antonio, Texas. And quite frankly, at the time, most people, both the civil rights advocates and those who were defending some of the state funding systems against this legal initiative, thought that this was going to be an easy win. This was kind of a slam dunk. It was Brown 2, you might say. Well, actually, we had a Brown 2 about the remedy in 55, so people saw it as Brown 3. This is what you needed to complete the Supreme Court's vision of equal educational opportunity. And the case was brought, as I mentioned, out of San Antonio, Texas. It was an ideal case from a plaintiff's point of view. We sometimes say in the law that bad facts make bad law. Well, the inverse of that, you would think, is good facts make good law. They had the best facts in the world from the plaintiff's point of view in San Antonio, because this is what happened. That greater San Antonio school district, school area, had 7 separate independent school districts, and there was one district, Edgewood, which was 95% Latino, mostly poor students, and that was located geographically, literally next door to Alamo Heights, which was a virtually all-white affluent district. And really, literally, depending which side of this avenue that divided the two districts, which side of that avenue you lived on, if you were a child, determined the fate of what your schooling would be. Because in Edgewood, the per capita funding was literally half, 50% of what it was in Alamo Heights. And this was despite the fact that the property tax rates in Edgewood were 25% higher than Alamo Heights. And, the fundamental base inequity here is the property tax system, which then in Texas and in most states in the Union and even today was our predominant form of funding for public education. And because this wealthy district had 8 times, literally, the property wealth of the poor district, even if they taxed themselves more, the people in the poor district could never catch up. So that's why they brought the lawsuit. And as I say, it was the ideal facts from the plaintiff's point of view. The kids with the greatest need were literally getting half as much spent on them as the kids across the street who had lesser needs. Couldn't have found a better ideal case. So that's why the predictions were that the U.S. Supreme Court was going to outlaw this fiscal inequity for Texas and for the United States in general. But somehow, when the decision finally came out, somewhat surprisingly, very surprisingly, it went the other way. It was close. It was 5-4, but the U.S. Supreme Court refused to take any action against this flagrant inequity. And the court didn't deny that there was an inequity there. They couldn't. They said this is a terrible situation. Somebody should do something about it. But it's not going to be the federal courts. And the basic reasoning in that decision was that education is not a fundamental interest. It's not a fundamental right under the U.S. Constitution. There's not a word about education in the Constitution. So even though the court had said in Brown versus Board of Education that education is probably the most important governmental service that anybody can receive in the 20th century, it wasn't important enough to be of fundamental interest for federal constitutional purposes. So I could spend the rest of the day going into all the interesting doctrinal bases that they got here, but essentially the court said that even though the system was inequitable, it furthered the state's interest in local control. Local control is a rational position for the state to take. And yes, local control results in inequities, but it's not enough to rise to a problem under the federal Constitution. So they kind of left it to the states. Actually, they specifically said if anybody's going to do anything about this inequity, it has to be the states. And they essentially told the plaintiffs, go to the state legislature, go to the state courts. Well, the plaintiffs didn't see much purpose in going back to the state legislature. They were the people who created the problem in the first place. For all the reasons that people were discussing in the first hour, it is very difficult for the underfunded districts who tend to have less political power to make headway toward full, real equity in state legislatures. So for lack of any alternative, plaintiff attorneys who were pushing this area said, we've got to try the state courts. Now, at the time, the plaintiff attorneys were not overly optimistic about what the results would be in the state courts. State courts were known at the time as being much more conservative than the federal courts. You had under the Warren Court this great move forward on civil rights in the federal courts, but that was not happening by and large in the state courts. And state court judges tended to be overwhelmed with their caseloads. They didn't have the resources. Some people said they weren't the smartest federal judges. I'll leave that aside. In any event, the plaintiffs were not too hopeful about where they would get in the state courts, but there was no option. So people brought some cases. And very interesting, in the mid to late 70s, after the Rodriguez decision had been decided, there were about half a dozen decisions in a number of state courts. The surprising thing was plaintiffs won just about all of them. There was the first major decision was from the California Supreme Court in the Serrano case that said, well, if education's not a fundamental interest under the federal Constitution, it is under the California Constitution, and we're going to uphold that right. So they issued a very strong decision that required equality in funding. The New Jersey Supreme Court came down with a decision upholding the right to education under their Constitution. Connecticut, West Virginia, plaintiffs are winning all of these cases. As you might expect, once attorneys in other states saw that you actually could win in the state courts, there was a slew of these cases brought in the decade of the 80s. You had about 25 or so states litigating this issue during the 1980s. But when you looked at the results over that decade, a very interesting trend. Plaintiffs won virtually 100% of the cases in the 70s. You get into the 80s, the pendulum swings the other way, and the defendants are winning two-thirds of the cases, 67%. So there's something a little strange going on here. Why were plaintiffs succeeding so well in the 70s, not doing so well in the 80s? But then the story gets even more interesting when you get into the 90s and the early 2000s, because from 1989 up until the recession in 2008, there's another slew of litigations, about 30 litigations again. Some cases there are repeats of people trying again, people like Steve Robinson keeping at it, even if they lost the first time. This round, the pendulum goes back, and during that decade, or say 15 years, from 89 to 2007, 18 years, plaintiffs are winning about 65, 68% of the cases. Looking back at this history, I started looking for explanations for these trends. Why is it going back and forth, the fate of these cases? And I think you see some very interesting phenomena. And that is, in the first round, in the 70s, the judges were very sympathetic to the plaintiffs. They understood that there was a gross inequity here, and if the courts had some ability to do something about it, they were inclined to take a stand. But what happened by the 80s is you got into the remedy question. And the point was, yes, the courts can declare the existing funding system unconstitutional, but then what's the remedy? How do you make sure that there really is an improved situation? And those first few cases that seemed so wondrous from the plaintiff's point of view in the 70s, by the time they got to implementing the remedies in the 80s, huge problems arose. In California, for instance, as a remedy, the court did the obvious logical thing. They said, well, if there's spending that's twice as high in rich districts as in poor districts, we're just going to issue a statewide order that says funding has to be equal in all districts. And that's essentially what they did, except for a very narrow degree of a few dollars that the difference could be. every school in California had to be spending the same amount of money. So everybody assumed that meant that the funding in the poor districts would soon rise to the level of what it was in the rich districts. But in California, the opposite happened. And instead of leveling up, as we call it, they leveled down. They had a proposition there, taxpayer revolt after this case, and put a lid on what taxes could be. And the net result was, many observers say, public education in California was totally undermined for decades. In the 70s, when the case was brought, California was 5th in the country in per capita spending. Last time I looked a couple of years ago, it was 47th. So it kind of knocked the bottom out of education funding in California. Not a great solution from the point of view of education advocates. New Jersey, the second state to come up with a major ruling in this area, their Supreme Court was really firm on this, and they've stood firm. From 1973 till about 2011, that's how long that case had been pending in the compliance stage in New Jersey. Case went back and forth between the state Supreme Court and the legislature literally 30 times. That's how many times the court was issuing orders, and the legislature was resisting. Then they'd make a certain amount of reform, and there were problems with governors implementing it. In any event, you had this huge institutional confrontation. And when judges in other states are looking at this and saying, wow, if we decide for the plaintiffs, are we going to get this rocky road that we're going to have to be having endless confrontations with our legislative branch? Not a very inviting prospect for judges to think about. So the experience in New Jersey was a real hurdle. On the other hand, when you look at it from the point of view of long-term staying power, that New Jersey Supreme Court accomplished a lot because today New Jersey is the only state in the union where the property poor districts, the inner city districts that were the plaintiffs in that case, actually are spending per capita more than the average of the affluent suburban districts. So fiscal equity has been fully achieved in New Jersey. And some of these districts have done great things with that money. Some of them haven't. That's another story about what happens once you get adequate funding. But by and large, the urban districts in New Jersey have gotten adequate funding. I could go on with some of the other remedial problems, but I think that's why by the 80s, judges looking at what's going on and saying, wow, if we go down this road, there are going to be real problems, tended to shy away from it. Well, if that's true, what happened starting in '89 that swung the pendulum back? And that has to do with this concept of adequacy litigations. It also has to do with what Commissioner Driscoll was emphasizing, which is standards. '89 was the year that the first President Bush called for the National Summit on Education that brought together all 50 governors, all 50 state education commissioners, business leaders, and they came together to try to react to the Nation at Risk report, those of you who may remember this, which said that our schools were in a state of crisis. We were losing the economic competition in those days to Japan and Germany, and as a nation we had to do something about it. What emerged from that was this idea of standards and standards-based reform. And that became the theme of education policy, both for the federal government and for the state governments. And you had bipartisan support for that. The co-convener of that 1980 summit, by the way, was the chairman of the Education Committee of the Governors of the National Governors Association, a guy named Bill Clinton. First George Bush, Bill Clinton did work together at that summit and in the follow-up of federal policies, which led us to No Child Left Behind in 2002 with its heavy emphasis on standards, on testing, on test-based accountability. And why did that make a difference for the courts? Made a difference for the courts because it made this remedy issue much more manageable. Instead of trying to figure out what we need to do, instead of battling back and forth with legislatures, the courts could just look at what the states were doing, saying, okay, the legislature came up with these great standards. We accept that. We have no reason to want to differ with the legislature on that. The standards are fine. But once we have evidence in a case that there were 64 students in a class, in the example that Commissioner Driscoll gave, or I can give you an example from the litigation we had in New York City, where the state standards required students in order to graduate to pass a lab science exam, but 30% of the high schools in the city didn't have functioning labs. A judge could get it pretty quickly that the state has standards that make sense. It says all kids can meet these standards, but you've got to give them fair resources to have an opportunity to meet the standards. So I think that's why plaintiffs started winning these cases. And it was a very impressive history, how that went forward starting in 1989, and the outcome of these cases changed dramatically. Then we get to 2008, and of course there's a major recession. We've had a very changed economic environment, a very changed political environment throughout the country since then. Plaintiffs' batting average, you might say, has not been quite as good since 2008, but given the changed circumstances, I think it's still remarkable. Plaintiffs have won about 50% of the cases since 2008, between 2008 and 2017. So the judges are still sensitive to this in many of the states, in most of the states. As I mentioned, overall, if you take the numbers since Rodriguez, since 73, plaintiffs have won 60% of the cases, as I mentioned. But they've lost 40% of the cases. And in some of the places where plaintiffs have won, the results have not been what was expected. So California, you can put in a victory column for the plaintiffs, but not necessarily a victory for the children in the long run, because it really has not improved the education system. So when you step back and look at this whole situation, and when I do, I must say, because this is something that I've not only been litigating, but now that I've got an academic perch, we keep track of all these cases, and on our website, by the way, you can keep up with these litigations in all 50 states if you're interested in them. They're still going on, very active things going on in Kansas and Washington. I guess we're going to have a new case in Massachusetts soon. So there's a lot of activity still. But after looking and thinking about this over this 45-year period, it's become pretty clear to me that if we're going to make real progress in this area, we have to think of going back to the U.S. Supreme Court, and we have to think of a federal solution. It's quite absurd that 60% of the states in the country are moving ahead as far as fiscal fairness is concerned, even though there have been problems in some states. Overall, where plaintiffs have won, the amount of funding that's gone to the poorer districts has gone up, usually because of the adequacy approach. What happens is it's not a Robin Hood situation. You don't take from the rich districts, but what you do is raise the poor districts and narrow the gap. And that's how you avoid terrible political confrontations. I think Chris or somebody was saying the problem with adequacy is that everybody rises so you don't close the gap. Actually hasn't been the fact, because I'll give you the example in New York after we won a big victory and we used the adequacy theory, which was another reason, by the way, why plaintiffs' outcomes shifted in the decades starting in the 90s, because that legal strategy became the predominant approach. I don't have time to get into that. But the net result of the formula that came out of our CFE case in New York was yes, everybody got an increase. There was a guaranteed 3% increase for every district in the state. But New York City, which had a high poverty rate, got a 15% increase. And other poor districts got 16 and 17% increases. So, yeah, politically, you worked it out that you weren't going to take away from any of the suburban districts and all. But that was a rising tide that pushed the poor districts much closer to where the rich districts were. In any event, from a national perspective, to have a situation where, for example, in Chicago, where plaintiffs went not 2 times but 3 times, they went to the state Supreme Court and got turned away each time. Right now, the per capita funding is literally half of what it is in New York City, where we won our litigation. Now, there are other factors there, but still, the disparity is enormous. Same kind of urban environments, same rough cost of living. Why should kids in Chicago get half as much spent on them? Why should kids in Providence get much less spent on them? We really need to see this as a national solution. And I think the fact that you've had this 45-year experiment, that's really what it's been. It's what Justice Brandeis called 100 years ago, the glory of our federal system, is that it's a laboratory of the states. You can try all kinds of different programs. You can see what works, what doesn't work. Well, that's what we've had for 45 years. We've had all kinds of legal doctrines develop in the different states. We've had all kinds of remedies. We've seen some of them work, some of them don't work. It's time for the Supreme Court to reconsider this matter, and they can draw on this rich experience and see if there's a national perspective that can make a difference. So the need is clear, and certainly in a state like Rhode Island, where the Supreme Court has said they're not going to interpret the Constitution in a way that gives many possibilities. If you think about litigation, and that's what I make a living doing, you've got to think about a federal approach. Okay, but obviously you're going to say to me, well, if the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 45 years ago that education is not a fundamental interest under the federal Constitution, what makes you think they're going to change their mind just because 45 years have passed? And during these 45 years, if anything, the court has tended to turn in a more conservative direction. So what sense does it make to talk about a new Rodriguez litigation? Well, let's dig a little further into exactly what the court decided in Rodriguez, because it's very interesting. I mentioned it was a 5-4 decision, and the 4 judges who were in the opposition, who were dissenting, were very strong in their dissents. They were very upset with what the majority was doing. And Thurgood Marshall, who of course had been the plaintiff's attorney in Brown, was now on the Supreme Court, wrote a really angry dissent. He knew what the stakes were here and what was going on. So he confronted the essence of the Supreme Court's decision head on. And he said, okay, I can't argue that there's not a word about education per se in the federal Constitution. But there is a 15th Amendment that says every citizen has a right to vote. And there is a First Amendment that says every citizen has the right to free exercise of speech. And we all know that nobody can competently exercise their right to vote or their right to free speech if they don't have some basic education. So it has to be a federal right because in order to exercise your core fundamental federal rights to vote and to free speech and other federal rights, you need a basic education. Well, Justice Powell, who wrote the decision for the majority, was troubled by this, and he took it very seriously. Powell, by the way, had been the chairman of the Virginia State Board of Education. He knew about education. He didn't deny what Marshall and Brennan and the other dissenters were saying. So he met them head on, and he said, we need not dispute the truth of what you're saying. Yes, you need some kind of basic education to be a capable voter, to exercise free speech. But the plaintiffs in this case did not give us evidence that says they're not getting that kind of education. We don't know what kind of education they're getting because their case was money. They said we're getting less money than the next district, but they didn't come in and say what the school district's doing with the money, what kind of education they're getting. So that claim we have to leave for another day. So they left that issue open. And the issue is, what is the essence of the basic education that students need to be capable citizens? And nobody has brought that back to the court for the last 45 years. So what I am telling you today is I think it's time to bring that issue back to the Supreme Court. And when I've said this in other places, because I'm very serious and we are, in fact, preparing a case along these lines, people say to me, well, the Supreme Court now is more conservative, certainly, than it was in 1973, likely to get more conservative year by year while you're preparing this case. Why is this the time to bring it if you didn't bring it 10 years ago or 25 years ago? Well, I think you all know the answer to that. This question of capable citizenship, this question of preparing our students to maintain and revitalize our democratic institutions, I think has gone to the top of the priority order of the thinking of most Americans these days. We have a polarized society. We have a political system that at best is at impasse. We have challenges right and left to the vibrancy of our democratic institutions. And I don't think it's realistic to think that our political parties and our political system are going to be able to dramatically change this situation. We may change some of the leaders. We may shift policies right and left or left to right. But the fundamental core problem that we don't have the civic spirit in this country, we don't have the sense of talking to each other, of listening to people with opposing views with an open mind and trying to work out compromises. We don't have this going on in our country to anything like the extent we need. And if there's any hope for moving in that direction, the hope has to come through our school system, educating the next generation. And you know, this is not a new theme. Commissioner Driscoll mentioned the Massachusetts Constitution and that funny language about cherish and all. You know who wrote the words in that Massachusetts Constitution? It comes back, it's from the 18th century, it's from the 1780s. Samuel Adams wrote that language in the Massachusetts Constitution. And yes, it's archaic language and all. But Adams was very clear, as were most of the founding fathers, that if this new republic that they were establishing is going to survive, as Ben Franklin put it, what have we created with this Constitution? We've created a republic if you can keep it. Well, Sam Adams was the first one to say the only way we can keep it is by educating all our voters. Now, in those days, they restricted the franchise, white males who were property owners. But today, we've expanded the franchise. Everybody can vote. Everybody should vote. And all those voters need to be well educated. Horace Mann, who founded the common school system in the 19th century, said it very directly. Quote, under our Republican government, it's clear that the minimum of this education can never be less than such as is sufficient to qualify each citizen for the civil and social duties he may be called upon to discharge. So it's been a constant theme throughout our country's history. The basic purpose of establishing a public school system was to prepare students to be capable citizens. So that language that they were talking about in Rodriguez is nothing new. What is new is that the schools have not been effectively carrying out this function for at least the past 50 or 60 years. And you know, we had all kinds of reference to NAEP scores from Commissioner Driscoll this morning. Let me tell you what the NAEP proficiency score in 2014, which is the last time NAEP tested civics, and they do test civics for 12th graders. 23%. That was the percentage of our students that are proficient in basic civic knowledge. When you get into civic values and civic dispositions, the situation arguably is even worse. I want to quote you the results of a recent World Value Survey on democratic attitudes. 72% of those who took this survey, who were surveyed, who were born before World War II, so that's the older generation, 72% of the older generation said it's absolutely essential to live in a democracy. What was the percentage of millennials, those born since 1980, that answered that question affirmatively? 30%. Only 30% of our young people considered it absolutely essential to live in a democracy. So I think this is a clear reflection of the fact that the schools have not been keeping up with their historic responsibility to prepare our kids for citizenship. And I can go into more statistics, low voting rates. U.S. has the lowest percentage of voters in general, 59%, I think, in the last election, something like 37% in the 2014 midterm elections. Again, the older people tend to vote in the 70%, and the younger people vote in 38% or so. So they're not being prepared to be capable citizens. Why has this occurred over the last 50 or 60 years? Well, you can start with the Vietnam War, the undermining of trust and faith in our institutions. You can look at national policies over the last 3 or 4 decades, and as much as standards-based reform has been a real shot in the arm on one hand. On the other hand, what it's done is focus attention solely on reading and math scores, and it's meant that social studies and civics and questions of that type have been substantially de-emphasized in the school. We've had the demographic changes that people have talked about, and that's presented more of a challenge. We have a much more substantial number of people coming from different ethnic, racial, religious backgrounds, and the classic telling of the myths of American history that were considered the patriotic values 50 years ago have to be reconsidered. Let's just put it that way. Not to say we can't come up with a vibrant pride in our country and its history, but it has to be more realistic. And a lot of people have worked on that, but it's hard. And teachers to teach this, and for teachers to deal with controversial issues, which you need to when you have a diverse population and a changing society, they've got to be well trained for this. It's not easy to facilitate those kinds of conversations. We've got the internet, which has great potential for informing people, for organizing people in civic activities. But as we all know, it's also got terrible potential for misleading, inaccurate spreading of news. And schools have to keep up with that. They've got to teach media literacy in a very effective way. They haven't been doing that. So these are just some of the reasons. We could go into that in more detail. This is the challenge. The schools, I think, in the long run, are our basic hope for revitalizing our democratic institutions, but there are huge challenges for what they need to do. And one of those challenges is the basic resource question. To undertake the kinds of educational initiatives, the education reforms I'm talking about, whether it's much more extensive teacher professional development on dealing with these things, having the ability to do media literacy, to deal with the nuances of changing populations, that's going to take resources. What's going to be even more fundamental is what you all know and what we've been talking about all morning. If you're going to talk about preparing all students, you've also got to deal with the reality that when kids are attending schools that they know are substandard, it's going to be very hard to convince them to buy into the importance of trusting our institutions and the importance of making democracy work when they know it's not working for them and it's not working for their families. So equal educational opportunity and equal resources, or equity in resources, is a big part of this picture. So this is what needs to be done, and to make a long story short, as you can see, I've been thinking about this for a while. One of the great fringe benefits I got when I moved from being a full-time litigator to being a part-time litigator and a part-time academic, which is what I'm doing now, is a couple of years ago, I had a sabbatical. That was fantastic. I got a year off. And I spent that year in some libraries and with a center up at Harvard researching the issues that I'm talking about with you. And, you know, I'm a lawyer by training. I went through all these historical perspectives on the school's role, studied what's been the problem and the decline in the last 50 years. I also was very pleased to see that there are solutions. There are demonstration projects. There are some schools that have gotten it right and are doing it right. They're small in number. The big question, as Gary Sass said, is how do we bring it to scale? Well, in my mind, to bring it to scale, we need to get a breakthrough. We need an outside force to shake up the schools, to shake up the legislatures. There are plenty of smart people, I learned, smart educators, smart policymakers who do have solutions to all these problems, but nobody listens to them. It's not a priority. So in my mind, what we need to do is get a major court decision that will shake things up, that will make it a priority, that will cause people to focus the attention they need on this. And for that, we need to reconsider this opening that the Supreme Court left in the Rodriguez case. So out of my studies during that sabbatical year, I put together a book. And if David Driscoll can hawk his book, I'll hawk mine. There was a flyer out there. It's coming out next month, but you can pre-order on Amazon. Anyway, called Failing Democracy, Schools, Courts, and Civic Participation. And there I lay out the case for why we need to do all of this, and I also lay out a legal strategy of how to bring this to the court's attention. And what I've been doing since I drafted that book a year or two ago is to start working on this case. And again, I took advantage of my new academic Perth. Actually, it's not that new. I've been there a while. And I've gotten some free student labor, and it's been terrific. I put together this symposium this year, and, you know, my basic position is at Teachers College. So I have a group of really bright education students who are looking into the education policy and social science aspects of preparing this lawsuit. And I also have an appointment at Columbia Law School, so I've got a good complement of law students that are looking at the legal strategies. And we've been making a lot of progress in thinking through what kind of evidence we have to show, what kind of legal arguments to make. We're actually at the point where we want to identify the forum, the venue, the place where we should bring this case. It's a federal case, so we can bring it in any of the 50 states. And we want to pick the place that is going to be most ripe in terms of can tell the best stories on the evidence. And also I've got the law students looking at precedents and the different circuits and the different district courts, because we'd like to, if we can choose, you might as well choose a legal setting that seems to be more open to this than some others. We've now identified 5 states that we're looking into in some detail. Our first criterion, by the way, for choosing a state is it had to be one of the 40% of the states that lost their state court litigations, because as much as I'd like to bring the case in New York, it would be very convenient for me. We won our case, so we're in a little better position than some other states, and also a federal judge may say, well, you got a right under the state constitution, go bring this case to the state judges. So we got to bring it in a place where the Supreme Court of the state has not been helpful to the plaintiffs. Make a long story short, we look at other criteria. Rhode Island's one of the 5 states that we're looking at. And we're trying to understand what the state standards are in civics. They seem to be pretty good here, but the resources, especially in the underfunded districts that allow people to carry out those standards, to prepare kids to be capable citizens, seem to be very subpar from our preliminary analysis. So that's one of the reasons I was very happy to accept the invitation that Gary and Tim extended to me to come here and tell you this story, and to meet many of you, and to learn more about what's going on in Rhode Island. And we're going to try to decide within the next month whether we want to file the case here or in one of the 4 other states we're looking at, which include Illinois, Florida, Arizona, and Connecticut. So the bottom line, I guess, of my talk is stay tuned, and whether we bring the case in Rhode Island or in one of the other states, I think this will be your fight as well as our fight. So I did want to inform you all of what's going on, and we'll ask for your support in whatever form it may be relevant, whether it's directly here in Rhode Island or in spreading the word if we start making any progress in one of the other states. And it's a long haul. You know, when I started the CFE case in New York, and one of the members of our board of our Campaign for Fiscal Equity said to me, "What do you think the odds are of our prevailing years from now?" And I said, probably 5 or 10%. Well, 15 years later, we got the legislature commitment for $9 billion. So it can happen. But whether the odds are still 10% on this federal case, I don't know. But I do know that it's a battle that is important. It's well worth fighting, and we're going to fight it. So thank you.